So, welcome, welcome. Good morning. Welcome back to the show. This is Right Wing Rico. And today I'm going to join a conversation virtually in my own way. That just happened about a half an hour ago with two brilliant men that are in Europe currently, Alexander Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris. And they're speaking on what's going on with this whole war in the Ukraine. Apparently, France and the UK are planning to send troops as peacekeepers into the Ukraine, and Russia already said if they enter into the war zone, they will be treated as enemy combatants and attacked instantly. Why they are insisting on doing this, there's only one or two reasons that they can be doing this. There's no actual good reason besides that they extremely dislike their troops, and to send them there knowing that they will be liquidated instantly for no actual good reason is a betrayal of the honorable men and women who have signed up to defend these countries. Our nation has already let the EU know and to let the rest of NATO know that if they go into the Ukraine, they're going in alone. They're attempting now to drag us into a war that we want no parts of. And their way of doing it is by forcing Article 5, if they are attacked in the Ukraine, forcing the United States to come in. Thank God that we have a strong leader now. But they're still going to try because, like they always say, these maniacs don't have a reverse gear. They only can go forward. They cannot stop. They can't slow down. And they can't go backwards. They can't reverse. So let's go ahead and join the conversation with actually two specialists who actually are closer than we are. I'm way across the ocean, but they are actually they're sharing a landmass. One is in Greece and one is in the UK.
All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening with Starmer and Macron and their plans to send troops into Ukraine. Last reports are that Starmer is looking at 30,000 European troops in Ukraine should a ceasefire be agreed on. So the Europeans, led by the UK and by France, they're going to enter Ukraine as a peacekeeping force. Macron said that he doesn't care whether Russia agrees or not. He said Ukraine is a sovereign nation. If they invite us into Ukraine, there's a ceasefire. They invite us in to keep the peace. We're going in. Starmer gave a speech the other day and said that the UK is now moving into the operational phase of boots on the ground in Ukraine, and the Russians continue to send warnings.
Listen, the reason I said this is a betrayal is because if they really wanted to fight the Russians, why wouldn't the French and the UK have went into the Ukraine when Russia initially invaded, and they had all of their ammunition, their weapons, their tanks, and they had about 500,000 more troops that were already in the Ukraine ready to fight? Why did you wait until you guys are pretty much completely demilitarized with no more men before you decide to go in? Why would you wait 3 years? Unless you're purposely doing this for the sole purpose of wiping out men. This was not meant to be won. This is meant to get people wiped. It would be more difficult for the Russians to successfully wipe these people because they would actually have an army. But if you're letting people just trickle into the Ukraine to be liquidated, that makes it a lot easier. This was never meant to be won. And that's my opinion. But I want to hear what the guys have to think.
The Europeans and to the Americans. The Americans don't trust the Europeans. They're trying to sabotage our peace talks. And to the Europeans, don't step one foot in Ukraine. If you do, then you will be seen as enemy combatants and you will be quickly annihilated.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on
you're
Macron and Starmer?
You're absolutely right. The Russians on this are absolutely clear. And Lavrov, as you discussed, gave that warning to the Americans just a couple of days ago. We discussed it in the previous program, in which he said, don't trust the Europeans. The Europeans are trying to use the Ukrainians to trick you. And you must be aware of that, because obviously if you're not, then this whole process could unravel. And Medvedev has issued a ferocious message about all of this idea of peacekeepers, and how in order for peacekeepers to enter into Ukraine, absolutely there has to be an agreement with Russia. And the Russians have already said that in order for peacekeepers to be able to enter Ukraine legally as peacekeepers, they must do so with the authorization of the UN Security Council, in which Russia has veto power. And if that isn't done, then they won't regard those troops who enter Ukraine as peacekeepers. So the Russian position could not be more clear. And they are repeating it even as we're making this program. So Starmer just plows on. He goes on planning this. Macron plows on. And you can see what the plan is. Get a ceasefire, any ceasefire. Get Zelensky to agree to deploy the peacekeepers. The Europeans go in, and a British minister, West Streeting, said that if the Russians attack them, it'll be a massive escalation and the blame will be on Russia. So, you can see, you disregard Russian warnings. The Russians say that the peacekeepers should not enter. You nonetheless insist on sending them there. That is not an escalation. If the Russians carry out their threats and attack the peacekeepers, that is the escalation. Now, it's an incredible, wild game. And can I say, Starmer called this meeting, it was a virtual meeting, 27 nations supposedly attended. The media here in London has not published a list of the attendees. It's quite extraordinary, actually. I mean, so we don't quite know the whole details of who attended and what happened. The Daily Telegraph was then briefed afterwards by officials who are familiar with what apparently took place. Those officials said that, in fact, there was no consensus about deploying peacekeeping forces to Ukraine. So when Starmer is talking about moving to an operational phase, it's only a minority of hardline countries, Britain, France, maybe some others, but far from the 30,000 men that Starmer is talking about. Starmer also had to accept that the Americans have not provided any guarantee or backstop, even though he continues to say that that is needed. But there's been no word about that from the Americans, that they've no signs so far that they are reversing their position.
Well, let me explain my theory. My theory is this is all purposely being done because they want to wipe away these men that are in these armies. They want to purposely kill off a bunch of military men because that would make it a lot easier to take over these societies in the long run. See, they have a taste of blood recently, and they want more. There's an article that was written by the Russians that goes over what just happened in Kursk. About 30 NATO officers were surrounded in Kursk. Now, Kursk is actually in Russia. Why are 30 officers from NATO in the ranks of the Ukrainian military wearing Ukrainian uniforms in Russia? Because remember, there was a Ukrainian invading force that took over a small area along the Ukrainian-Russian border. They're telling you that the officers, and of course, these are officers over their own soldiers, they are all a part of NATO. The Ukrainian soldiers have already been wiped. The Russians are already fighting NATO. These people did not make it out. These are soldiers from the UK, France, Australia, and several other NATO nations. You would call them mercenaries, but they are there fighting for NATO. They were wiped. That was the test. They want more of their soldiers to be wiped by the Ukrainians. like I keep telling you, is I'm only telling you what the Russians have told us. This is a war between heterosexual males versus gay males. Countries that support pride parades versus countries that do not. I'm not making this up. I'm not exaggerating. Keir Starmer is obviously gay. Emmanuel Macron is literally married to a man. These are their soldiers that are underneath them. Most of them are going to be heterosexual. They have no problem watching them get wiped. Again, this is Klaus Schwab's war on the world. The men that chased him into the closet 60 years ago, he's having their revenge. He's having his revenge on their sons. That is what's happening. And that's why it's so confusing, everyone, because no one's looking at it from the bigger picture. Everyone thinks this is an individual thing about winning a war in the Ukraine. It's not. This is a depopulation move, and they are specifically targeting men, military-aged men, like it says in my description. But this is what, but again, 30 NATO officers, 30 officers from NATO countries were captured and surrounded and killed in Russia. What the hell is NATO doing in Russia? I thought we weren't in this war. Apparently, what I've told you the last 2 years is absolutely true. And what both the Alexanders have been saying, NATO has always been a party to this war, and Russia has defeated NATO. But now this is about depopulation. They want more of their troops gone. But think about it. If their troops are depopulated, but America's army is still, hefty and strong, well, then that defeats the entire purpose. So they have to bring the Americans in. Trump's not going to go for it. But they're going to try. And they're going to try to guilt us into coming into this war. And that's what the Alexanders have both pointed out. So I'll let them finish.
So what is this all about then? Well, I think that this is fulfilling multiple different roles. Firstly, it's intended to create trouble between the Americans and the Russians, to introduce into this an issue which could perhaps lead to the breakdown of the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians. The second is that it's also part of that long-term policy that we've discussed many times to try to drag the Americans into the conflict. Now, all of this is reckless. It's completely irresponsible. The most extraordinary thing about this is that Starmer is persisting with this, despite the fact that in Britain, there is a mounting backlash against this idea. There is an article today in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, by Nick Timothy, who was one of Theresa May's advisors, in which he eviscerates this proposal. He's saying, why is Starmer doing this? What is this about? We have seen evidence that Starmer's popularity after a brief bump is declining again. We've had more information that Britain is in recession. The economic numbers for January were terrible. There is a major rift within the Labour Party because Starmer wants to carry out cuts to various welfare benefits. And there's talk about a rebellion within the Labour Party.
Again, the reason this is all confusing to them is because they're not considering these other reasons why. They're not considering the fact that this is about wiping out the population of military-aged men in these countries. It's amazing that the campaign from 2021 also seems to have an effect where it's wiping out military-aged men between 14 and 55. Specifically, those are the ones who are just dropping everywhere since they complied. However, if you comply with this war, military-aged men in Europe are also going to be dropping like flies in the Ukraine. And there's no reason. Remember, the Ukraine is not an ally. They're not a part of NATO. They're not a part of the EU. They're actually the most corrupt country in Europe. No one owes them anything. You have a very small handful of people, and they're all gay men for the most part, except for a couple of women who are probably also gay, all working under the World Economic Forum. They're darlings who are pushing for these wars. There's no one else. That's why they're doing this unilaterally. They're not even getting permission from other aspects of their governments to do this. This is just pretty much the presidents pushing for boots on the ground, and they're trying to rush and do it before anybody can stop them. This is about wiping out men. And I know the Alexanders, they're by the book and they're reading this and they're trying to be fair and report on all angles. The theoretical part that I'm proposing is one that typically a lot of people will stay away from, but I think they're kind of leaning towards agreeing with what I'm saying. I'm gonna let them finish.
And there's grumbling, there's increasing grumbling that Starmer is giving more time to Ukraine. Even before the Ukraine crisis, all this talk about peacekeepers and peacekeeping contingents started, there was already talk in Britain that he was spending around half his time on foreign policy. And now the view is that he's spending around 2/3 or 3/4 of his time on foreign policy, even as the situation within Britain deteriorates. And people are asking, what is he doing? And has he thought this through? And is this really a workable or viable plan? And that he's setting up Britain, whatever European allies he has with him, for disaster. And there's growing doubts and many questions. But put all that aside, this is a very dangerous proposal. It is at some level absurd that the British and the French are coming up with these ideas, apparently without the Americans, without the guarantee from the Americans, without the troops really to send to Ukraine, with no operational plan for these troops. But it doesn't make it any more dangerous that they're coming up with these ideas in defiance of the very, very clear warnings that they're now getting from the Russians.
It's insane that I have to point out to everyone that around the Western world, not the whole world, because it's not happening in China or India or these other Asian countries or even in South America, they're staying out of these wars. And in Africa, they're not doing this either. But in these Western countries, primarily English speaking, formerly of the Commonwealth, all military-aged men are set for euthanasia, and they are all being wiped systematically for the past since 2021. The population of military-aged men throughout the world, in the Western world, is declining. So what will the Western world be? BRICS will be set to take over. And that's why I keep saying that, you got to use foresight. You got to look ahead to see where things are going. And you want to get there first mentally. What I'm seeing is that China is not expending any of their military, any of their weaponry. They're not using any of their equipment. They're not involved in any of these wars. Their population is is 4 times our population and 6 times the population of Europe. And they're just sitting there waiting while we literally let all of our men potentially be destroyed and killed off in these useless wars, while China will be stronger than ever. And Europe, it will be poised for an invasion. And if we don't join the war, then we can fight. But I don't even think they want to invade us. I don't think they want to invade the United States. But to be honest with you, we just know that it's easier to take over a country or a society if the strong men are neutralized. You leave women or you leave feminine men in charge, you can just walk right over them. They are literally setting a trap by trying to wipe out as many strong men in the Ukraine as possible. And we can all tell now, because none of these other moves make sense. We've never seen anything like this in history.
It's absurd from all of those aspects that you just mentioned. But I mean, the absurdity of it is, wouldn't the Russians know that these thousands of troops are heading into Ukraine? I mean, can they be hidden? Do they even have these troops? How do they get there? Once they get there, don't the Russians see them? The minute they cross over the border, don't the Russians just annihilate them?
I was just talking about that the other day. We were saying, well, how are they going to get these troops into the Ukraine? what are the logistics? What does it look like? Are you going to go by train? Are you going to go by plane? Do you know how hard it is to move 30,000 men? I mean, how long is that going to take? Yeah, that's none of it. It's not adding up. And apparently, they're not talking about sending Poland or Polish troops in. They're talking about the UK and they're talking about France. But let's look at when you compare the UK and France to Poland. Poland is an Orthodox Christian society also. They are not doing the gay and the trans stuff as much as these other nations. They probably see the play and they don't want to wipe their men out. Viktor Orban seen the play years ago and he decided he's not going to participate either. That's why only certain countries, the countries that promote these pride parades, the countries that were getting all that USAID funding to push the gay agenda and do these shows and yada yada, those are the ones that are talking about sending their troops to be melted. You got to think about it. These men that I'm talking about that are gay, they have a disdain, they have a hatred for hetero men who have children and wives and women. They have a very strong hatred for them. I don't know if you can tell by their behavior, but it's there. They and these other countries know what's happening. Putin knows what's happening. Trump now knows what's happening. That's why we're saying we're not falling for this globalist trick to wipe out our men. We're going to need the men to fight the globalists soon. That's what's happening.
And then what? Well, Starmer goes to Trump and say, help us, please help us. And the United States has already said, no, we're not going to help you. We're not involved in any. The United States has told Europe, go into Ukraine. They've told them, if you want, go in. We don't have a problem with it, but we're not giving you any backstop or anything.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly the point that Nick Timothy made in that article of the Daily Telegraph. We send the troops in. They're going to be massively under-equipped. They're going to be relatively few. What are these troops supposed to achieve? And if the Russians do attack them, what then? What exactly happens? This is the question mark that Starmer isn't answering. In fact, the title of the article is "The Prime Minister Cannot Dodge the Hard Questions Over Ukraine," and that's, of course, exactly what Starmer is doing. Now, I think that you have to understand what Starmer is all about, because Starmer is very unlike any other British Prime Minister that I can remember, because there's already been a book that's been published which says that fundamentally he's a cutout. He's not really the person who is in overall charge. I am absolutely sure that this plan that we're seeing being put together has been discussed by Starmer, or at least by Starmer's people, the people who are running Starmer, not just with the French and with the other Europeans, but with their friends in the United States. Remember, I mean, Starmer has his contacts with the Democratic Party. We know all about that. He's got his contacts in they have their contacts in the American deep state as well. So this is not quite as absurd as it appears to be on the surface. It's more dangerous than it appears to be on the surface, because Starmer is pursuing, or rather the people behind Starmer are pursuing two objectives here. One is to bring Britain back into Europe, bring Britain back into the EU, because this is going to be a force which the British is going to be participating in, which is going to be made up predominantly of European countries. So even if this never gets off the ground, Britain again is involved in Europe. It's discussing things with European leadership. It's talking to Macron. It's talking to Ursula. It's behaving almost as if, in terms of security policy, it already was a European country. So bear in mind, that agenda is always there. Bring Britain back deeper into Europe again. But secondly, it's intended to create ultimately a crisis in Ukraine, a crisis with the Russians, and a crisis which they hope not only will involve the United States, but which ultimately will damage Donald Trump himself.
And you know what? It's a lose-lose situation if you're Trump. They're going to destroy your name and run you through the media. They're going to call you a coward. They're going to say you left our allies out to dry if you go in, if you don't go in. But if you do send American troops and join this pointless war against the Russians, every single body that comes back, they're going to blame you individually for their kid's death. So it's lose-lose. Honestly, I'm glad that Trump's saying we're going to stay out of it. There's no point of us being in it because we know the agenda. The agenda is bright as day. The depopulation agenda has been announced. Anybody with any sense, anybody who's in power, they know what's happening. You have those who want to do it and those who do not. And we don't control these other nations. Donald Trump is only the president of the United States. Starmer's in charge of the UK. Macron is in charge of France right now. So unfortunately, it's going to be up to the people in those countries to save themselves. It's not up to us. It's not our job. We couldn't save the Ukraine. We couldn't save them from themselves. They sold themselves out to the globalists and they put a price. I guess it was $500 billion for the lives of all their men. And so be it. We paid for it because the goal, the agenda is to wipe out as many of these men as possible. And I guess the cost was cheap to buy the lives of those men. It was very affordable, apparently. So, and if you're a globalist and you're in charge of these countries, you got your money's worth because these men are gone. Generations are gone. And they're trying to send other generations from other countries into the meat grinder in the Ukraine. The only place you can really do it because it's the most corrupt country in Europe. Do me a favor, like and subscribe, share the video so I can keep you up to date with this topic. Also, I have a new page, The Single Boyfriend. I'm going to be doing other red pill topics on there as well. So follow that page on YouTube once you get a chance.
Because if there is a crisis with the Russians, then if Donald Trump doesn't rush to the Europeans' rescue, he'll be accused of betrayal and all of that. And of course, if he does, well, he's committed to Ukraine. And then people will be able to turn around and say to him, look, we warned you, you can't trust the Russians. And here you did, here you have, and you look where it's got us. So it is ultimately intended to bring Britain closer into Europe, preparatory to Britain ultimately rejoining the EU again. That is obviously a part of the agenda. And the second, as I said, is to undermine Donald Trump.
Yeah, how can you allow the Russians to annihilate our number one ally, our special relationship with the UK? How can you allow this to happen, President Trump? You really are a Putin puppet. You really were trained by the KGB.
You see, even they know exactly what the play is going to be to shame Trump, and they think they can play on his ego. Not this time.
Whatever they're going to. This is like Russiagate on steroids.
Yeah.
That's what they're hoping to turn this into.
Exactly. And bear in mind, I mean, they will also say if there's a crisis with the British and the French troops in Ukraine,
which there will be.
If there is a crisis, they'll say if you don't rush to their rescue, you are destroying NATO.
Yeah,
because all of that. So you know, I think the Russians are trying to warn Trump about this. I don't get the sense that he's fully understands.
No, he likes Macron.
He likes Macron.
He likes Macron. He has a weakness to Macron. I've never understood it. I don't understand this weakness that he has with Macron, but he has this affection to Macron. I don't get it.
No.
Starmer, he doesn't like. But what does Trump do?
Well,
how does the Trump team get ahead of this? Let's call it a trap, because that's what it is. How do they get ahead of this trap?
Okay, well, look, see, this is why I love listening to these guys. They see that this is a trap. And now they're doing something that a lot of people seem to not know how to do anymore. Use forward thinking to figure out how to get out of this trap that we're obviously walking into. Remember, this is not about defense. This is about depopulation. They want these men to go in there. Remember, All of their weapons, ammunition, tanks, everything's been destroyed. All of these countries in Europe have been demilitarized. Germany is deindustrialized. I mean, they can't replace weapons. And now you want to send troops in 3 years later after everything's been taken away? It's suicide. But if you're in a depopulation nosedive, then suicide is what you want. You want crash dummies. You want people that are just going to just throw themselves into the fire without question. That will not be the United States. Now, these other people keep saying they stand with Ukraine. Standing with Ukraine doesn't mean shit. Are you willing to die for the Ukraine is what we need to know. And if you are, we are going to need you to go to the front without hesitation. Standing with Ukraine on the internet is different than dying for the Ukraine in real life. I did a poll, actually, if you're watching this on X, participate in a survey where I asked people, I asked them, are you willing to just stand for Ukraine or are you willing to die for the Ukraine? And I want to see what the turnout is. So let's keep going. It is a trap.
There's two ways. Firstly, and I think they need to be much clearer than they've been up to now, that if the Europeans go into Ukraine, they are doing so not only without the support of the United States, but that the United States strongly disapproves of their going there. I mean, that will strengthen the very real opposition which exists in Britain and which is building. So, and not just Britain, I'm sure, even more so in France. I mean, bear in mind, more and more European countries are skeptical about this. Meloni, who is close to Trump, is known to oppose it. So I think the Americans need to be much clearer about their own opposition to this. And secondly, in order to prevent British and French deployments, if there is going to be any kind of ceasefire or perhaps cessation of hostilities, they need to work out the enforcement arrangements with the Russians. In other words, they need to address properly all the points that Putin made in his press conference of a couple of days ago. So, because if there are already ceasefire monitors, say from China and Brazil, or from India and Brazil, or from whomever, then they could say, look, there is no role for the Europeans and they should stay out. So that's what they need to do.
Remember, they're not going to do that because they hate their soldiers. They want them to be wiped away. They want them liquidated. They want them gone. Trump loves our troops. Biden had no problem abandoning our troops in Afghanistan and literally just giving everything to the Taliban. Remember, there are certain people who dislike the military. The militaries of these countries are full of men that are strong. That's very difficult when you're looking to do a takeover using mental manipulation. These are not takeovers by other strong men where it's basically a fight to the death based on physical brute strength and kinetic warfare. The World Economic Forum and the globalists, they use manipulation. They use media. They use fifth generation warfare. It's not kinetic. So it's not about who's the strongest, it's about who's the smartest. Someone like myself is going to sit through it. A lot of these plans, it seems like I maybe created them myself 30 years in the future. And that's why they make so much sense to me. And it's so easy because, I mean, they're brilliant plans. Brilliant. If I was going to take over a society, I would get rid of the men. By any means necessary, I would use, 4 or 5. I would have a backup for a backup for a backup for a backup. It wouldn't be just one try, one attempt. But you would have to trick these men into going along with it. That's where the manipulation comes in. That's where the media comes in. And that's why people who can think on our own, we watch all the zombies looking at a television, believing everything they hear. We don't understand. It doesn't make sense to us because it's obvious to us what is happening.
But above all, the Americans need to be alive to what this is all about. Now, I'm going to express here my own opinion about Starmer, which is that, in my opinion, Starmer is not there to succeed as Prime Minister, not in the conventional sense. If he leads the Labour Party to a massive electoral defeat in a couple of years, that's not the concern of the people who basically back him. They want him to keep Britain on a particular political course, back towards Europe, as I said, reversing Brexit to the extent that they can. Also, rolling back these changes in the United States. They used Starmer to crush Corbyn, and they're now using Starmer to do all of these other things. The fact that he isn't very interested in the state of Britain's economy, that he's trying to commit Britain to a rearmament program, which of course he can't fulfill. That ought to set alarm bells about what his genuine agenda is, or rather the agenda of the people who run him is. And the fact that, as I said, he's had all of these contacts, these historic contacts with the Democrats, and all of that should tell you who is really running the show in London.
Yeah, that's a really good assessment. Starmer is there to crush America first, to crush Trump, and he's there to crush Brexit.
Yeah.
And Russia, Ukraine, it helps him get closer to that agenda.
Exactly.
That's why he's doing this.
Exactly.
Should his bluff be called?
Yes.
I mean, because there is a lot of theatrics in all of this. Obviously, there's a lot of theatrics. Everyone knows that the UK military is not going to last a week in Ukraine. Everyone knows the French military is not going to last 2 weeks in Ukraine. Everyone knows this.
Yes.
That's why there's a sense of fear and dread, but there's also a sense of just ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
Yes. Yes.
That we're moving to this point. But should his bluff be called, for example, by the Russians? I don't know how you would do it. I don't know what statements you have to make. But what should Russia do in all of this outside of the warnings? I mean, Medvedev is saying, come on in and you're going to get annihilated, you scumbags. That's what he's using, words like that. That's the words that Medvedev used in his post. What should the Russians do?
Do me a favor, like and subscribe, share the video, Safe and Effective Podcast. But this is also Alexander Mercouris and alexanderchristoforou on the Duran, and they're great, and they're out of Europe, so they're closer. I mean, they could literally drive to the front in the Ukraine if they wanted to. So it's in their best interest to actually know what's happening and to keep up with it. So follow these guys. I'm going to link the video in the description with their names to follow as well. But this is a Safe and Effective Podcast. I'm Right Wing Rico. Follow the new page, The Single Boyfriend, as well. And we'll keep you going with more updates.
I suspect are actually doing is that they're trying to explain to Trump how dangerous this plan by the British and the French is. And they're probably going to try to explain to Trump, look, if you want to move forward with this, you've got to scotch this. You've got to make it absolutely clear to the British and the French, not just that you're not going to support what they're doing, but that what they're proposing is completely unhelpful and wrong, and that it is actually jeopardizing peace. For some reason, Trump seems very unwilling to do that. And that's the problem. He's avoiding giving security guarantees to the British and the French. But he's got to go I think he's got to go further. And I think this is what the Russians are going to say to him.
Well, listen, the truth is we're just the Americans. We cannot guarantee anything against the Russians. We can guarantee against some Iraqis, maybe against some Libyans, maybe even against a couple of the Mexican cartels. But can we really give a security guarantee against a nuclear power with a military the size of the Russian Federation? Hell no. Could we give a security guarantee against the Chinese? Hell no. We are not good as Americans. We are not good when it comes to fighting other standing armies. We're not. Our military has been in Ukraine for the last 3 years, and then we got spanked under Biden, under Macron, under these other leaders in Europe. We've got annihilated in the Ukraine. The last of their military fell in Bakhmut. So that was their third army that the Ukrainians had in 3 years. Since then, it's been, for the last, 8-9 months, it's been pretty much just NATO NATO mercenaries fighting over there and just getting themselves killed for money. You know, soldiers of fortune is what they call themselves. Trump is honest. People keep saying Trump's a liar. Oh, he lied, but they can never tell me what he's lied about. I asked them, show me where he's lied. He's a straight shooter. He's not going to tell you we can give you a security guarantee. He knows our military versus the Russian military, we lose 10 out of 10 times in every war game or simulation, which is why we have never, ever tried to go up against the Russians. We're posturing right now against Iran. We're not going into Iran because Trump's not going to lose American troops and get embarrassed. It's a stain on his name, unnecessary. Well, we're going to posture because he is influenced by Israel, but there's nobody else influencing him to throw our troops into the meat grinder in the Ukraine or against the Iranians. So we can't give any guarantees. So that's what I hope these guys can hear this.
You've got to go further, and you've got to tell the British and the French that if there's any such plan, the United States will oppose it. And they need to tell all the other European countries, if you go ahead with this, you are going against the wishes of the United States. And that will kill it, by the way. I think despite all the bluster in Europe, small countries like, say, the Czech Republic are not going to defy the United States on this one.
Poland's not. They've already said they're not going to defy the United States, but Poland will go in.
I told you what he thinks they're going to go in.
Ukraine if the U.S. orders them to go in, and they'll stay out of Ukraine if the U.S. orders them to stay out.
The Poles are not dumb. They're not about to go and waste all those good men. They're going to need those men. You don't understand. They are going to weaken every military in NATO so that there's no more men. And that way, when they bring actual men from the third world, these other invading Islam, men from Islam, these northern African countries, the Middle East, there will be no military to fight those invading hordes. They're literally going to bring the populations of these BRICS nations into Europe, an invasion. But first things first, you got to get the militaries of these countries to wipe themselves out. Now, Russia won't be invaded, but via the Ukraine, via Europe, the rest of these, Europe's already being invaded, but there won't be any military to stop them eventually if they can get these militaries to fight each other. And that's exactly what's happening. There won't be anybody left to fight the hordes that are coming from the Middle East and Northern Africa.
The Ukrainians are pretty much on record saying that. So let's play devil's advocate. What if Trump ends up supporting the UK and France? Say for some reason he gets this pressure from the neocon faction of the Republicans or from the neocon faction of America First or whatever. There are all these forces in the U.S., the intel agencies. I don't know. Let's say he gets this pressure. Trump himself, maybe Trump, says, you know what? I really like that Starmer guy. I definitely like Macron. So I'm going to come to the rescue of our number one allies, France and the UK.
Then he risks drifting, and I'm being moderate in my language here. He risks drifting into a state where instead of getting peace, he finds himself in a crisis with Russia worse than the one that Kennedy faced in 1963.
A crisis that we realistically have no chance of winning. If we did have a chance of winning, we would have already went into Russia. We don't. And we shouldn't have been thinking about doing regime change and dividing up Russia anyway. That's fucking disgusting. We were just thinking about going in there and declaring war. And there's really no good reason. The Russians don't want Europe. The Russians only wanted the Ukraine to stay neutral. That's it. They didn't want to take their land. They didn't want to do this. They begged not to. And all they said they wanted to do was denazify the Ukrainian military and make sure Ukraine stays neutral so that there's no NATO weapons on their border. Why is that so much to ask? It isn't. It isn't. And right now we're watching the aftermath of what happens when things go wrong and when the World Economic Forum gets their way. Trump's not going to fall for it. Europe's on their own. If they want to go into these countries, don't beg us for help. We're not coming. And I'll be honest with you, the other European nations in NATO, I'll be honest, if one day you wake up, you turn on the news and they say there is no more NATO, it dissolved itself because they were not, other countries are saying we're not going to be triggered by Article 5 to go into the Ukraine and aggress the Russians, which is suicide. These are countries that some of these leaders love their troops. They love their people, their ethnicity. There's not a lot of countries where in Europe where the country is going to stay pure, where the people who look European are still going to be European in 5 years. In France, it's over. The UK, it's gone. Ireland is gone. Scotland is gone. Have you seen what the elected officials look like now in these countries? Invaded. Wiped out on a genetic level. Wiped. So they're really, so these last remaining EU, NATO countries are not going to, they're already going to be facing invasion. But now you want to speed up the process by us letting our men get killed in Russia for a pointless war? Yeah, right. They're not going to do it. And even if the Americans order them to do it, they're not going to do it, which is lucky for them.
1962, just as that.
Like and subscribe, share the video. If you have any comments or if you have any opinions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to respond to those. You can follow me on Instagram, Rumble, and X, Twitter X. So thank you for tuning in, and I will be back with another topic in about 30 minutes after breakfast. Cheers.
I've been needing to find a new apartment, which has not been easy with credit as bad as mine. Luckily, I found cosigning.com. They connected me with a cosigner who helped me get my dream apartment for me and my dog. I just paid a small fee and was able to move in fast. Get the cosigner you need for the apartment you want. Check out cosigning.com today.